This is Nan McKay, and I would like to introduce you today to Leilani Farha. Leilani is the global director of The Shift, an international movement to secure the right to housing, and the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing. She's also the central character in the documentary Push, regarding the financialization of housing, screening around the world, and now co-hosts a podcast, PUSHBACK Talks, on the same subject. So welcome, Leilani Farha.
Thank you so much, Nan. It's a pleasure to be here.
In your role as the Special Rapporteur on adequate housing with the United Nations, you spent years working to understand why housing was becoming so unaffordable to so many people. What was the biggest surprise you discovered?
That is a good question. I was the rapporteur for 6 years, and I think it was within the first year or so, I came across a figure, a monetary figure, and it was the figure for the global value of real estate. And it was $217 trillion. And then I read that 75% of that was residential real estate. So $163 trillion was the global value of residential real estate. This was back in 2016. And I thought to myself, wait a second, I'm traveling the world and I'm seeing people live on pavements, under bridges in some of the most affluent countries in the world. I'm hearing about tenants who can't pay their rent, who have no money. And yet the value of residential, it's the biggest business in the world. So that for me was a light bulb moment and a very, I was surprised by that. I had no realization that real estate had become the biggest business in the world, basically.
When you talk about human right, some people think that housing as a human right, some people think that you expect governments to give housing to everyone who needs it, which doesn't seem very practical. Can you clarify more about what you mean about the shift to considering housing as a human right?
Yeah, that is the myth about the right to housing. And I guess it's the phraseology, the right to housing. So people think, governments often think, oh, that means everyone's should be able to knock on government's door and demand a house. And that is actually not at all the definition. Obviously, where people are living in homelessness, that is an egregious violation of the right to housing, and it does have to be addressed immediately. You can't, especially in affluent countries, you can't have people living in homelessness. But the right to housing means so much more than just that sort of idea of the built structure and government provision of the built structure. I mean, there's so many things, if you look at our housing landscape, that need to be addressed, whether it's discrimination in housing that makes it really difficult for racialized communities, for example, to access rental accommodation or to enter the home ownership market. That could be resolved through the right to housing. Things like tenant precarity. So, tenants who are subject to rent increases overnight sometimes, no protection against rent increases. That could be solved and addressed through a right to housing approach. The idea of the right to housing is that it gets realized progressively. The governments need to take steps over time to improve the housing conditions that people are living in. The other sort of side to that is the adequacy side. A lot of people are living in overcrowded units or units that are, not really habitable, with poor pipes or, lead pipes or lead paint, etc. Those things need to be addressed again over time. I would say this, Nan, I think the game changer with the human right to housing versus just treating housing as any matter of, any old policy matter or a financial matter. The game changer is how we look at people in relation to housing. Once you say housing is a human right, you realize then that everyday people, vulnerable groups, disadvantaged groups have an entitlement, that housing is a right because it's so essential to life and dignity. And that changes then how we look at policy. It's no longer about charity, giving out handouts. That's not what, if you subsidize housing, those people should consider themselves lucky. No, it becomes what's necessary to ensure human dignity and a human right.
So it doesn't just involve Congress giving HUD more money.
Definitely not. It's a revisioning. That's why we started the shift, where I'm now the global director, a global movement to secure the right to housing, because we really feel in the shift that what's necessary is a change in perception of housing, away from housing as a commodity or an asset class, a place to park and grow capital or leverage capital, to a place of family, community, a place of security against things like a pandemic, for example. So no, it's not only about expenditure. Of course it involves expenditure, but it is about so much more. It's about understanding that discrimination has driven inequality in terms of housing in many countries, including in the United States, for example.
So do you think that some of the answer in inequality lies in financing, banks, HUD doing more, maybe enforcement and testing? How do you think that could be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I love that question, and I'm glad you went there, Nan, because a lot of people don't talk about the relationship between housing and the growing inequality we're seeing in our communities and our cities. And there is a direct relationship. You cannot have housing and residential real estate worth $217 trillion and not understand that that is a major driver of inequality in our cities. I mean, it just makes sense to think of it that way. I think governments need to get their head around the fact that property speculation, investment in property is really creating this huge divide and wedge between those who have and those who have less, or those who have nothing. And until governments get their head around the fact that their policies on the financial side, on the tax side, on the monetary and fiscal policy side, have a direct bearing on inequality, we will never solve inequality.
Well, how do you think the big financial players are hoping to capitalize on the current pandemic-driven housing and economic crisis that has many homeowners in forbearance, many mom and pop landlords behind on their payments, and many renters facing eviction?
Yeah, so I mean, I haven't sort of gone into the details around this big business of housing, but basically what happened, in fact, in the US, it happened very clearly and starkly after the global financial crisis. What we saw were these big financial actors move into housing as a vehicle for wealth accumulation and wealth leveraging. And these big actors, I'm talking about private equity firms like Blackstone, I'm talking about pension funds, insurance companies, all of whom are investing in housing as a way of, accumulating wealth and capital. And if we don't understand that they're playing such a major role in housing, and that they prey on crisis situations, we are not going to get out of this pandemic without them replicating what they did in the global financial crisis. So I'm quite concerned, to your question, I'm quite concerned that what's happening with the pandemic is that there are a lot of, and I'm putting it in quotation marks, assets that are going to be very ripe and prey for these big financial actors, that they're going to swoop in and start buying up again foreclosed mortgages, cheap debt, they call it, that they're going to start buying up apartment buildings that are, in some kind of forbearance situation or some kind of a distress. That's what they look for, these financial actors, because that's how they make money. They hedge their bets. If we buy this asset and we can get a good deal on it because it's distressed and we will drive down that price, they're hedging that in a few years they're going to make their money back 10 times, 20 times, 100 times. That's what I'm quite concerned about is, and I'm not sure governments, like, is HUD looking at this? Are they concerned about this? Is Congress concerned about this? I don't know. That's what I'd be worried about if I were in government in the US.
I think most people worried about the cost of housing are not thinking about how changes in investment strategies, and that's kind of what you're talking about there as well, but by groups like a South Korean teachers pension fund might be driving up home prices in your neighborhood. So maybe connect a few more of those dots and examples of how financialization impacts local housing prices.
Yeah, and connecting those dots is super important. It is more direct than people would think, in fact. So let's take a pension fund, for example. I did meet with the South Korean pension fund. It's the third national pension fund. It's the third largest in the world. And that pension fund had been told by their national government, the government of South Korea, that they wanted better return on the investment that the pension fund was making. So most listeners may not know, or viewers may not know, that pension funds have a certain expectation of return on investment, and most pension funds have investment arms. So they might have like a separate entity or body set up to do investments for that pension fund. And so they're looking for where should they invest their money, and we're talking huge dollars. And so in the case of South Korea, they gave their money to a private equity firm. The private equity firm they gave their money to was Blackstone. Blackstone's role and job is to invest on behalf of their investors. So Blackstone will take that money and then invest in what they think is going to give a good return for their clients. In the case of, real estate, residential real estate is a very solid and safe place to invest. So they will invest and buy up buildings where people are living, and they particularly target affordable places that people are living, because they know that they can ratchet up the rents and create a bigger return on the investment by doing so. So it's a quite a straight line. So the private equity firm will invest and buy 7 buildings, thousands of units. I was in New York. They had a private equity firm, it wasn't actually Blackstone, had bought 1,700 units in one transaction and suddenly became the landlord. And within 3 months of ownership, they raised the rents astronomically. And so that is the direct relationship. What communities need to do is start mapping who owns their buildings. And where there isn't penetration by the big financial actors, communities need to figure out how to protect those assets against purchase by the big financial actors.
Because the obvious thing is that if you ratchet up the rents, then the people that are living there can't afford the rents, which means that they're not paying the rent. Then the owner evicts the family, and the family then has nowhere else to go because you have a lot of investors buying up the affordable housing. Is that the cycle that I'm hearing?
You've nailed it, Nan. Fantastic. That is the sad and horrible state of affairs. Often what tenants will do is they actually won't, especially in the United States, they won't allow themselves to be evicted, because if you get that attached to your name that you have been evicted, it will be almost impossible for you to rent another place. If you look at rental agreements, landlords won't rent to you if you have a history of eviction. And so what tenants will do is they will vacate the premises themselves. And then, as you say, they often cannot afford to live anywhere else in their neighborhood because rents are so high. They'll either have to move farther away, or in many cases, people are living in their cars. I've met families in the United States in many cities living in their cars, in motorhomes. And then the next step from there is living on the streets or in a shelter, a navigation center, et cetera, and pulling yourself up from that place back into where you want to be, to security, to good housing is very, very difficult. So that is the cycle. You really nailed it there, Nan. Thank you for that.
Well, I think a lot of people think that we're talking about subsidized housing when we're talking about affordable housing, and it's not necessarily so, especially during the COVID times, because you may have somebody that had a restaurant, for instance, and maybe was very successful in the restaurant for years, or a person that worked in the restaurant for many years. And now all of a sudden they're out of business, and what they built up in the past may no longer be there. Those are people that we're talking about as well, not just people who are in subsidized housing, but people on the next level up who never envisioned themselves to be here, and here they are. And now what are we going to do about that group of people?
That's exactly right. And even before the pandemic, it was that group of people that really motivated the filmmaker Frederick Gertten to make the film Push. The nurses, the firefighters, the police officers, the young tech startup folks who were really struggling to pay rent. People who, one, make cities work, hairdressers, I add them, bartenders, they're the people who really are the engines of a city, for example, some of those, and yet they couldn't afford the rent. And then add to that a pandemic, job insecurity, underemployment, and unemployment. And absolutely, those are the people that are being driven out. So it isn't just any longer the poorest people. It isn't just any longer people with psychosocial disabilities who fall into homelessness. It's families, it's working people. We know now in the United States, in Canada, where I'm from, in many countries, having a job is not security against homelessness. Absolutely not. And that is what needs to shift. That's what needs to change. Employment should lead to secure housing, and we need laws and policies in place to protect tenants and ensure they have the security that they need.
You mentioned Push. What are ways that people can view access to the documentary Push and then engage their community leaders to take action?
Yeah, so we want everyone to watch Push because we think it's so relevant to so many people in communities and cities across the world, and particularly across the US. If you just simply Google pushthefilm.com, you'll get to a landing page and all the viewing options are there. We really highly recommend hosting viewings and then post-screening panels and discussion groups. Use the film to inform yourselves. I am always happy, if my schedule permits, to sit in on a panel and have a discussion about the film and ideas for how to protect your community against financialization. And I know the filmmaker is always happy to engage in those discussions as well. But you don't need us. Communities can do that all on their own. The film costs a few dollars to purchase or screen, and groupings and discussions, that will lead to action.
It seems that communities should not just wait around as housing in their neighborhood gets bought up by global investors. And you've talked about the film Push, and they'll have a lot of ideas. Can you give us a little bit of hints and insights into what kinds of things communities or states could do?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of activity around the world of different things that tenants in particular are trying to resist the financialization. That mapping that I talked about, figuring out who owns your community or your city or your neighborhood, is really important. Quite difficult in the US because you don't have what we call transparent beneficial ownership laws there. So you don't necessarily know who owns your building. It could be a shell company, a numbered company, and you wouldn't have a warm body or a real name to know, but it's still worth trying to figure out who owns your city. I think that exercise is important because it'll also show where there are vulnerabilities in your community. Oh, that building is owned by mom and pop landlord who, because of the pandemic, couldn't make their mortgage payments. That property might be ripe for being, preyed upon by a big financial actor. So that mapping is happening, for example, in cities across Germany. But tenants are also really pushing governments for better tenant protections. And I think that's really important. Improved landlord-tenant law, rent freezes or caps, rent control. I know that's controversial in the States, but that's a direction that many cities are moving in. Controlling Airbnb so that those investors in Airbnb don't eat up affordable housing stock. Creating laws around renoviction, so landlords can't just go in and turn a regular apartment building into luxury and then increase rents for that reason. There's lots of legislative action that's being advocated for. Lastly, I'll say, I understand that there is a housing solution summit being pulled together. What he's trying to do is bring together all those folks out there who have interesting but tried, tested, and true solutions to the housing crisis, to bring us all together under one umbrella, to have these important discussions about how we're going to save affordable housing and build more affordable housing in our cities, especially across the United States.
Well, it's going to take a village to do what
Absolutely.
You and I are talking about. So thank you so much for being one of the cogs in the wheel to help build that village, Leilani.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I've been doing this a long time, and I feel there's such energy right now around housing. So I'm really happy to continue my work and to be in conversation with so many others.
And yes, we can.